After the last Indian Wars of the 1800s, most of America had literally written off North American Indians as being extinct. Many believed they were either killed off or fully acculturated into mainstream society. The general public thought that American Indians are a people and culture of the past. And because they were part of the past, Americans did not have to concern themselves with the plight of American Indians in the present. The reality, however, is that American Indians were not extinct. And while many were acculturating to mainstream America, the majority were still fighting to protect their reservation lands and their rights to continue their culture and traditions. Central to understanding American Indian activism in the 1960s and 70s, one must understand U.S. government and American Indian relations in regards to treaties and reservations. Historically, American Indians across North America were forced to sign treaties that gave up most of their land. We are talking about thousands and sometimes millions of acres per American Indian nation. Part of this treaty ensured that a small piece of land would be reserved for that particular Indian nation. In addition, in exchange for giving up their means for survival, that being land, the U.S. government promised subsidies and government programs for each reservation, such as housing, hospitals, employment, schools, etc. Thus, part of the American Indian political activism in the 1960s, 1970s is to once again force the federal government to live up to their treaty obligations towards American Indian peoples. After World War II, the U.S. government initiated the termination policy that would dissolve all treaties and cut off their responsibilities with American Indian nations. Tribes would no longer be recognized as sovereign nations under the protection of the federal government. This was done on a tribe-by-tribe basis, where eventually 109 tribes were terminated. This impacted over 13,000 Native Americans who lost tribal affiliation. This meant that whole tribes were disbanded, losing what land they had left along with any fishing and hunting rights. It also meant the loss of federally funded health and education programs. The reasoning behind this? Well, it would force American Indians to assimilate into mainstream America. The federal relocation programs were implemented, offering housing and employment programs in urban areas. But the reality is that mineral resources were being discovered on Indian lands, and this was a way to access that potential wealth. In the urban areas, due to the federal relocation programs, now this may sounded like a nice deal. Newly relocated Indians, however, found themselves forced to live in the slums and ghettos of urban America, where they faced the same discrimination that other people of color and immigrants were facing at the time. At the center of American Indian civil rights and political activism is self-determination and sovereignty. Sovereignty is the exclusive right to have control over an area of governance, people, or oneself. A sovereign is the supreme law-making authority. Self-determination is a principle often seen as a moral and legal right that all peoples have the right to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. For American Indian, sovereignty and self-determination meant the ending of the termination policy and respecting and living up to treaty agreements set by Indian nations and the U.S. government. It also meant retaining reservation land base and the right for American Indians to resurface and continue to practice their culture and traditions. While the government began to relocate reservation Indians in urban areas such as Minnesota, Seattle, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, New York, and Chicago, an unexpected consequence evolved. Urban Indians from all different tribes and nations began to gather, and an intertribal point of view and concern began to develop. In addition, more and more American Indians began to attend universities and colleges across the nation. Numerous Indian newspapers and journals were established. Native American history and culture became a topic of serious study, and American Indian students and community workers began constructing and developing American Indian study centers and community colleges. These urban Indians, as individuals and organizations, returned to their reservations and brought their new experiences and skills with them. They began to work closely with their elders, most of whom were quote-unquote traditionals, and they began to struggle together for tribal sovereignty and self-determination. AIM, or the American Indian Movement, formed in 1968. It was a militant American Indian civil rights organization leading many of the actions throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. AIM members were urban Indians that were inspired and influenced by Black civil rights movement erupting around them. They loosely modeled their organization after the Black Panthers for self-defense. AIM will participate and lead a series of actions that will grab national attention, creating a media stir and capturing the public's imagination. AIM will redefine U.S.-Indian relations and put front and center issues of sovereignty and self-determination. They also played a pivotal role in resurfacing American Indian pride by revitalizing Indian culture and traditional practices. Some early and notable actions were the American Indian Fish-Ins, with the goal of protecting Northwest American Indian tribes' fishing rights. In addition to this, the occupation of Alcatraz, which was an intertribal attempt to turn the island into an American Indian cultural, educational, and spiritual center. This event, or occupation, galvanized Indian activists from all over the country and utilized media coverage and Hollywood stars to draw attention to theirs. The occupation symbolized the strength and organizational level of pan-Indian activism. While the occupation failed to force the government to support the idea of turning Alcatraz into a cultural and spiritual center, it did achieve other goals. Principally, it brought an end to the federal government's policy of termination. It forced the U.S. government to adopt an official policy of Indian self-determination. From 1970 to 1971, Congress passed 52 legislative proposals on behalf of American Indians to support tribal self-rule. The Bureau of Indian Affairs budget was increased by 225%, and it doubled funds for Indian health care, established the Office of Indian Water Rights. Scholarship funds were increased by close to $1 million for college students. It also provided more funds for economic development and drug and alcohol recovery programs, in addition to expanding housing, health care, and other programs. Most importantly, however, Alcatraz also set the tone for the Red Power movement. Alcatraz was a catalyst for an emerging movement of Indian activism. It sparked other various occupations across the country to draw attention to American Indian historical and contemporary grievances. It took over unused federal land and sometimes government buildings. The 72 takeovers or occupations and these various actions were either planned at Alcatraz or the participants in these actions were at Alcatraz. Other well-known events were the Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972 on the eve of presidential elections where American Indians broke into and took over the BIA office, causing a media embarrassment for the Nixon administration. Shortly following was the occupation at Wounded Knee. This was in 1973 on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. It was a 2.5-month siege that involved a shootout between the American Indian activists and the federal government. These high-profile demonstrations and actions, only possible through mass organizing, pressured President Nixon to pass several legislation bills that underlined tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Number one was the 1975 Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. This authorized the Secretaries of the Interior and of Health, Education, and Welfare and some other government agencies to enter into contracts with and make grants directly to federally recognized Indian tribes. This authority gave the tribes greater control over the funding, which affected their welfare. This act also made self-determination rather than termination the focus of government. The act reversed a 30-year effort by the federal government to sever treaty relationships with and obligations to Indian tribes. Number two, equally important, was the 1978 Native American Religious Freedom Act. This was created to protect and preserve the traditional religious rights and cultural practices of American Indians, Eskimos, Aleuts, and Native Hawaiians. These rights include access to sacred sites, freedom to worship through ceremonial and traditional rites, and use and possession of objects considered sacred. The Act required policies of all governmental agencies to eliminate interference with the free exercise of Native religion based on the First Amendment. This Act also accommodated access to and use of sites to the extent that the use is practicable and is not inconsistent with an agency's essential functions. It has also acknowledged the prior violation of that right.